Well, as many of you know, I work at the Carter Center, and Oz Nelson is the chairman of our board of trustees, so he's my boss. And it's very good to be introduced by one's boss. Such a going. I used to get a lot of different kind of introductions when I first left the White House, quite often by Republicans who wanted to alienate me from the audience. And when I got one of those negative introductions, I always said, of all the introductions I've ever had in my life, that was the most recent. But I don't have to say that with Oz, because that was a beautiful one. And I'm very glad to be here. Well, my life since I left the White House has been very fulfilling. And I think it's best illustrated by a cartoon I saw in the New Yorker last year. This little boy is looking up at his father. He says, "Daddy, when I grow up, I want to be a former president." So I have a very wonderful life since I left the White House, and working at the Carter Center with Oz Nelson is one of those gratifying experiences. This morning, I know you and the Andy Casey Foundation, the National Families in Action, are addressing a very important issue. And to some degree, I've been involved in this question more or less on an international basis. As some of you, I'm sure, know, there are a group of presidents and former presidents, primarily in Latin America, who have been concerned very deeply about the same issue. The basic question that was proposed to me by the Foreign Minister of Colombia earlier this year was, we're addressing a problem. Is this going to be an emphasis on imprisonment and crop destruction? Or is there going to be an emphasis on rehabilitation and treatment? And I think that oversimplifies a complicated issue, but it's still being addressed quite extensively. I belong to a group called the Elders, which I describe in a somewhat humorous way as a has-been politician. It was founded about 5 years ago by Nelson Mandela and his wife, and it comprises Archbishop Tutu and Nelson Mandela, his wife, Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General of the United Nations, former presidents of Brazil, former president of Finland, former president of Ireland, the former prime minister of Norway, former chief peacemaker for the United Nations, and so forth. There are 9 of us now. And in that group, we have been called upon to address the same issue that you're addressing now. And that is the status of the control of drugs, and particularly marijuana. And when we had our last semi-annual meeting 6 months ago, we saw a 50-minute film that has been made and paid for by Sir Richard Branson and others, and produced with the leadership of President Cardoso, an elder like me, and the former president of Brazil, and others. It points out the struggle that is going on now between many of these countries, particularly in Latin America, that have to address the United States attitude toward drugs and the adverse impact on their economy, on their farmers, of some of the rigid provisions of American policy. When I was in the White House, now 34 years ago, in 1979, I made a major speech on my administration's drug policy. And I called at that time on the decriminalization of marijuana, but not its legalization. And I added a comment that the punishment for possession of marijuana should never exceed the adverse effect of the smoking of marijuana. And the speech didn't receive any adverse comments to amount to anything. There was a general consensus in my country then, your country, that this was a good way to address the problem. Not to make the possession of marijuana a criminal offense, but to try to treat those who were addicted to marijuana and other drugs and minimize their use. Since then, of course, U.S. policy has been focused in another direction. My successors in office, beginning with President Reagan, has been just the opposite. And we've adopted a policy of punishment for the possession of marijuana. And in countries in Latin America where the drugs are produced, to destroy their crops and to try to change their basic way of life. So there's been a growing dissatisfaction, I think, with the current status quo in this very important issue. Since 1981, when I left office, there has been a 7-fold increase in the number of Americans who are in prison. America is now the #1 nation on earth in total number and also on a percentage basis of people in prison. And as I said, we have 7 times as many people in prison as we did when I left office in the White House. This is very damaging to many young people. Rosa and I have worked with a group of young inmates in our hometown where ones that want to be carpenters and bricklayers volunteer as prisoners to do some repair work for small towns. We live in a small town of Plains that has 635 people in it. And as these young people came over to work on the project in our town, it was amazing how many of these young, mostly white boys were in prison for crimes relating to marijuana. So this is a very devastating impact on their lives on a permanent basis because they were convicted of a felony. And as you know, California and a few other states have 3 strikes and you're out. We had a governor later that got a law passed in Georgia, 2 strikes and you're out, which means if you're convicted for 2 felonies, you're in prison for life. In California, it's 3 felonies. And quite often the possession of marijuana is a felony. And this almost aborts the possibility of a young felon to have a productive life thereafter. So something has to be done about this. I don't favor legalization. I think you have representatives here from Colorado and Washington who voted last November to authorize the legalization of marijuana. And I would be very interested in knowing what their response has been since the passage of that referendums, and also what their experience has been as they put laws into effect to bring this into being. I think we must do everything we can to discourage marijuana use, as we do now and belatedly with tobacco and with excessive drinking, drunkenness. I've been almost a fanatic opponent of cigarette smoking. I was in the only family known on earth for a number of years that had 4 of my siblings and my father who died with pancreatic cancer. My father, my mother died with cancer, my 2 sisters died with cancer, and my brother died with cancer. 4 of them with pancreatic cancer. And the difference between me and them is I've never smoked a cigarette. And all of them were cigarette smokers. And I've seen throughout the world now, as the United States has tightened up on cigarettes, that the tobacco companies have shifted their emphasis to the countries where they can, with impunity, induce children to become addicted to nicotine. I noticed in some of the material I got from Nelson that collectively the alcohol industry and the tobacco industry spend almost $60 million per month promoting the use of their products. And as we know from the revelation a while back when all the states were involved, that the tobacco companies admitted in their private correspondence that they concentrate on inducing children to become addicts. This is something that must be prevented as we go into the field of increasing authorization for the use of marijuana, not only in the 2 states that have authorized its use directly, but also those others that let it be used for medical purposes. Tobacco still kills about 430,000 Americans per year. And what we want to make sure we prevent is making marijuana smoking attractive to young people. And I'm sure that's one of the things that the producers of marijuana and those who have benefited from it are going to try to do. I've been very pleased with the 12 provisions that have been developed by this group. I think they're very superb and need to be put into effect. First is no advertising of marijuana under any circumstance. Not let marijuana be used in schools. Make sure that marijuana is put in the same category as drunken driving if someone drives under the influence of marijuana. And let all those areas in states that have now made smoke-free areas, for instance, be also marijuana prohibited from being smoked. Those kind of things, plus a few others, I think are very beneficial. And I hope that Colorado and Washington, as you authorize the use of marijuana legally, will serve as very strict experiment stations, you might say, to ascertain how we can avoid the abuse of marijuana, particularly by young people. I'm very proud of former Congressman Patrick Kennedy and for his Project SAM, that is smart approaches to marijuana. I've read a little bit about it. Patrick Kennedy is looked upon in my household almost as a member of the Carter family because he's worked so intimately with my wife on removing the stigma from mental illness. And Patrick, my wife is very excited about you being in Atlanta, and I'm just very grateful to see that you're involved in this issue as well. Patrick was responsible, along with his uncle and others, in trying to make equity between the treatment of mental illness and physical illness in legislation. I wish him and Kevin Sabet every success in your somewhat independent project to make sure that marijuana is handled responsibly. Well, in closing, let me say that all of you have my thanks, my admiration for addressing this difficult issue in such an enlightened and scholarly way. And I believe that this is going to be a burgeoning question of increasing importance as we see marijuana introduced, I say, increasingly legally with its use in America. And the balancing between the strict control of marijuana and the prevention of its being introduced to children is becoming addictive, and the emphasis being restored, I hope, on treatment of addicts of all kinds as relates to drugs and their rehabilitation in society is a very important issue. So thank you very much.